Today, we are talking about the Battle of Culloden, fought on April 16th of 1746 between England and Scotland. In fact, it was the last battle in the uneasy history between the two countries. This engagement caused the downfall of legendary warriors and changed the course of life for a fiercely independent tribal people of the Highlands. Their defeat in this battle resulted in the conquerors passing laws that tried to alter centuries of traditions. This battle is as legendary as its defeated warriors. At least, that much we can all agree upon. And then, we enter the world of myths, legends, make-believe stories of national identity, and outright deception. In the next 2 episodes, I will attempt to separate fact from fiction.
Fact. Bears eat beets.
Oh, bears do not.
Bears beats Battlestar Galactica.
The final battle, fought between England and a loose coalition of clans known as Scotland, took place at Culloden Moor on April 16, 1746. I used to love the idea of brave, fearlessly loyal, independent to a fault Highlanders. I was influenced by some quality examples of pop culture, such as Brave and the Outlander series, which did little to change those romanticized notions of Scottish, heroic Highlanders and their fight for independence. It's little wonder that the Battle of Culloden has been on my short list for some time now. And as I started to research this topic, I realized that reality is vastly different than the commonly accepted perceptions. A conflict between the Celtic ancestors who put aside clan differences to defend their homeland and the stoic British soldiers is just the beginning of the many myths surrounding this conflict. Even the most obvious question, who fought who, can be called into question, since there were Scots and Brits on both sides. And it wasn't solely a clan army. Many of the units were from the Scottish lowlands, as well as Irish and Scottish soldiers in the French service, and some English volunteers. The legendary version of this encounter reduces this conflict to a struggle for independence, led by the Highlanders, who were mythologized, against the English invaders, who were predictably and not undeservingly demonized. As I dug deeper, I discovered a story full of tragedy, woefully poor planning, and an event that changed Scottish culture and the British military's structure, leaving me even more captivated than before. First things first, we need some reference points in order to better understand the situation of each side in the conflict. The Battle of Culloden took place in the mid-1700s, but to understand the why of this conflict, we have to rewind 60 years and dive into the messy history of British royal succession, which was way more complicated than the Megxit situation of today. The Battle of Culloden was the culmination of a French-supported rebellion raised in the name of the Catholic Stuarts, and aimed on unseating the reigning Hanoverian dynasty in Britain. Recall that in 1688, during the Glorious Revolution, Parliament and the overwhelmingly Protestant English nation deposed the Roman Catholic king James II. James was understandably upset that he was kicked off the throne, which he felt was rightfully his. Thus, he turned to his people, the Scots, for aid. Even though James ruled the British throne, he also ruled Scotland, just like his father. James's Protestant daughters from his first marriage, Mary and Anne, reigned after him. But when Anne died in 1714, leaving no heir, Parliament replaced the Stuart dynasty with their German cousins, the Hanoverians. The claims of the Catholic son of James II, James Francis Edward, the so-called Old Pretender,
oh yes, I'm the great pretender,
were simply ignored. During the first few decades of the 18th century, the Old Pretender had unsuccessfully attempted, with either French or Spanish backing, to raise the banner of revolt in Scotland the home of his forefathers. By 1745, the Hanoverian dynasty appeared secure. So, when the news arrived that the Old Pretender's son, Prince Charles Edward, the Young Pretender, had landed in Scotland with a handful of followers, there was initially little alarm in London. Bankrolled by the French, and there was no lost love between the French and the English at that time, the prince was gathering support amongst the Highland clans. This attitude of indifference changed quickly when Charles Edward's army defeated government troops at Prestonpans in September of 1745, occupied Edinburgh, and then, in November, entered England. The 5,000-strong, mostly Scottish army marched as far as south as Derby, but failed to gather English anti-Hanoverian support. It was confronted by converging armies made up of British troops, recalled from fighting in the War of Austrian Succession. On the 5th of December, the army of Prince Charles, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, as he was affectionately known, began its retreat back to Scotland, where they got some fresh local reinforcements, with a small dose of French military love. After receiving the French reinforcements, the Scots then defeated the first government army sent against them at Falkirk on January 17th of 1746, reaching their high military watermark. From there on, their fortunes just went downhill, as the French king, Louis XV, decided to divert his support away from Scotland and towards the increasingly demanding conflict on the continent. Before moving any further with our story, it may be of use to introduce the commanders of the opposing armies that were pitted against each other in the campaign that culminated in the Battle of Culloden. Prince Charles Edward, 1720 to 1788, was born and brought up in Italy and possessed virtually no military experience before arriving in Scotland. However, his army's early victories convinced him that the Highland charge, with broadsword in hand, was irresistible. It's pretty easy to dismiss him as a joke from a military perspective, yet his personal bravery, tenacity, and considerable charm partially compensated for his rather limited experience. Ultimately, it was the lack of military cohesion among his commanders that sealed the fate of the brave and determined Scots and their allies. On the British side, we have another prince as commander, William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, who lived from 1721 to 1765. He was an enthusiastic soldier from a young age, known as the Martial Boy, who was already a captain general of the British Army. He was considered an incipient military genius, largely because of his bold conduct at Fontenoy a year before, a notable yet epic defeat at the hands of the French. A strict disciplinarian, Cumberland restored the confidence of the army defeated at Falkirk, introducing a new bayonet drill to combat the Jacobite use of broadswords. His 9,000 men constituted a well-balanced force of horse and foot, supported by 10 3-pounder cannons and 6 mortars. In contrast, the Highland army had about 7,000 men, but they weren't a cohesive force. Their mounted arm was very weak, competing for first prize for military incompetence with their artillery units, which were a sad collection of 12 cannons of different calibers, which were poorly equipped and served. The two commanders continued to play a game of cat and mouse throughout the winter of 1745 to 46, and while the Scottish army enjoyed the home turf advantage, British troops once again underscored the immense importance of well-oiled military logistics. They also enjoyed the ongoing support of the Royal Navy, which supplied them with ammunition, food, and reinforcements. In fact, in late February, the Royal Navy instituted a blockade of the East Coast, with a flotilla under Rear Admiral John Byng, preventing French reinforcements from reaching the coastal ports. That was the beginning of the end for Prince Charles. as the intensifying shortage of provisions, money, and ammunition left him little choice but to accept a battle before reaching Inverness. At this point, our Bonnie Prince is near the fated fields of Culloden. The shortage of money and food had shaken the morale of his men, and with no recent decisive victory under his belt, he began losing the support of some clans. Several Jacobite units loyal to Prince Charles were still en route or engaged far to the north, but upon learning of the government advance towards their position, the Jacobites assembled their main army on the 15th of April at the estate of Culloden, 5 miles or 8 kilometers to the east. The Jacobite leadership was divided on whether to give battle or abandon Inverness, but with most of their dwindling supplies stored in the town, there were few options left for holding their army together. And so, again, as we've seen in previous episodes, we have an army whose poor supplies have left them with little choice with respect to timing and location of the battle, which took place on the unprepossessing flat grounds near the town of Culloden, called Drummossy Moor. Lord George Murray, one of the senior commanders in Prince Charles's army, did not like what he saw, and deemed it not proper for Highlanders. The best site for Highlanders was one that optimized the Highland charge. This battle tactic is what most people think of when they hear the word Highlander. Think Braveheart. So it merits a small digression. The Highland charge was best executed on firm ground with a downward slope to carry them to their enemy. Speed was essential for the charge to work. The army faced their enemy head-on and began yelling and banging their charges to instill fear in their foes. The Scots moved slowly at first, and then as they got closer to the enemy line, they would start running. They ran through musket fire and must have seemed fierce and fearless. When they reached striking distance, the Scots would fire their muskets, but rather than reload, like the British, they would then cast them away to begin their sprint. The smoke from the musket fire acted as a brief screen to shadow them as they charged. The Highlanders would race into the front line with their broadswords. Such an impenetrable mass would quickly break through the ranks, and, typically, after only a short burst of hand-to-hand fighting, the enemy would begin to withdraw. You can imagine that after seeing that firsthand, the British army spent many sleepless nights. The smartest among them spent that time thinking of how to counteract this tactic. Eventually, they figured out what to do. But you will have to watch the second episode to find out how. In preparation for the attack, the government army camped near the town of Balblair, and on the 15th of April, all was set for the battle to begin. Here is where the old wisdom, know thy enemy, would have really given Prince Charles a massive advantage. He was expecting the British army to attack on the 15th, but that was the day of Cumberland's 25th birthday, and he decided to give his soldiers an extra ration of brandy and a day off. And so it was. The Jacobite army stood at attention, awaiting an attack that never came, while enjoying a nice freezing drizzle with nothing to eat or drink. By 4 p.m., it was obvious that the Brits were happy and merry, toasting to their commander's health. The Scots then realized that there would be no battle, and the long day of waiting was finally over. The army was hungry and exhausted and just ready to sleep. But then, a genius, and most would agree that it was the good old Lord Murray, came up with the bad idea. Actually, the idea was excellent. It was its implementation that was subpar. Everybody in Scotland knew back then, as they do now, that when it comes to alcohol consumption, one Scot was worth 10 Englishmen, who really could not hold their liquor well. Thus, the evening of extra brandy consumption would render most of the British soldiers incapacitated. While all of this could have just been urban legend, Lord Murray clearly thought that Cumberland's boys would be unable to fight that night. And it could be fun to take the army on a refreshing march around the enemy camp and catch them off guard. Scottish soldiers were very unhappy, hungry, and cold. But when Murray promised them the unfinished portion of brandy and leftover food once they reached and overran the British camp at Balblair, most rallied to the cause. Would they be able to encircle the peacefully sleeping British army? Please return and watch the second part of this fascinating engagement, the Battle of Culloden, on my channel, The Most Intriguing Military Battles.